Sometimes I think that we could have a prayer after that and go home. Well, it's good to be here tonight, and it's good to see all of you again. And Jared and I are going to take a few minutes discussing a topic that, because we want to help. And I want to say that at first. There's a lot of qualifiers that come with this, and one of them is simply that we want to help. And Jared and I talked about this, and we don't attempt at all to group people together with loss, because we understand that loss is different with every single person. And I'm talking about for just a few minutes when it's you grieving, and Jared is going to continue here in a minute and talk about when someone you care about is grieving. After the feeders lunch today, my family sat there, and I always enjoy the feeders lunch. And everybody was kind of leaving, and there was about 6 or 7 ladies there left. We were just kind of all sitting in a circle, and I was contemplating the lesson tonight, thinking about it, and I look up, and the 6 or 7 ladies that are sitting there have all encountered grief in an unimaginable way. And I think sometimes their best lessons are right in front of us, and we skip them sometimes. And so I asked them to share, if they didn't mind, what helped them get through their grief. And as each one of them began to share, I was seriously taken back at the amount of wisdom that was pouring out of their hearts as they talked, and a few of them with tears. Husbands' names were mentioned because they needed to be. Statements like, "I wanted him home where I could be his caregiver." Statements like, "I had to immediately think about raising my other children." So they experienced maybe a delayed grief or a complicated grief. But they said they had to learn to adapt. They had to learn to cry. They had to learn to laugh. They had to learn to get help when you need it. And I want to simply be a little bit vocal tonight and about something that maybe you're experiencing or have experienced or might experience in the future. But I understand, again, everybody's different. And I noticed with the ladies, I asked them what got through their grief, and there was something that kind of kept getting announced in every one of their statements. And each one of them spoke, and they talked about their specific circumstances, but every single one of them was different, but yet they all announced in a way, the grief isn't over. The grief isn't over. And personally, I don't think that you get through grief and then you're done with it. I think you grieve in many stages for the rest of your life. And we also like to place limits on people's grief. But the ladies today reminded me they are still grieving, some for 30 or 40 years. Grief is a normal response. It doesn't necessarily have to be a death. I remember God grieving that man's wickedness has become so great in Genesis 6. He grieved. So it's a loss in that sense, and any loss can bring grief. There may be those of you that have experienced loss, but not necessarily death. Maybe those of you that have experienced loss in ways that might surprise us all. When I was 15, I had a great friend pass away when I was about 15. And he had been with me all of my life, and if I ever wanted to go somewhere, he wanted to go too. And I wanted to do this, he would say, "Sure, let's go do this." And so we went everywhere together. His name was Nickel. He was a Husky. And I remember when he passed away, I cried, and I cried, and I cried, and I cried, and I cried. He'd been with me all my life. So we just heard about the loss of Mary Cooper. I'm telling you, I heard about it 30 minutes before tonight. And do you know how many hundreds of people knew her handwriting? So grief is a normal response. I remember Jacob grieving over Joseph, the loss of Joseph, and he was grieving so much that the sons and daughters came to comfort him, and he didn't want any comfort. Do you remember that? Or I remember David grieving the loss of his infant son. Or I remember Jeremiah, grieving also, weeping. Or David grieving at the loss of his best friend, Jonathan. There's so many examples in Scripture we have people grieving. But when it's you, I believe that the Lord isn't just with you in your grief. You know, we sometimes make that statement, the Lord's with you in your grief. I believe the Lord is with you through every single stage of your grief, however long they last. And counselors have tried to create steps for stages of grief, and they put it all into a box, and there's no order to it. There's no length of time to it. There's no box to essentially put around it. There's no grief just like anybody else's grief. So they stopped trying to do that. But some of you might say the first step is to look at the shock of it all. That may be what the first step is, and that the dazed idea of the shock and you know, people talking around you and no idea as to what they're saying. Maybe some of you went through that. Or maybe you started grieving before the one you loved passed away. You know, I was talking to someone not long ago and spoken with people who have grieved because they didn't grieve. Because they had grieved for so long in the passing of their loved one, and then they didn't grieve when it happened, and they were grieving because they weren't grieving in that sense. Maybe that's you, or maybe you start to process but don't realize the permanence of it until later, accepting what's happened. People are showing up to see you, and there's this hazy feeling where they're talking, and I've seen that before. Lane and I were comforting someone, and we know they're not listening, and that's okay. People wonder what to say, and sometimes people who are grieving also wonder what to say, and the hurt and the pain, and maybe you're going through the anger, or maybe it's how it happened or how it didn't happen, or maybe it's the promises that you both made to each other, specific reasons that you grieve. Maybe there's the guilty feeling that you might have. I wish I would have done this, or I wish I had done that, or was it something that I did? I was talking to a lady just recently, and she opened her heart just a day or two ago, and she said there was anger. She's talking about the loss of her husband, and she said when she went to, before her husband passed away, she went to move something, or a wheelchair or a walker or something, and it got caught, and she hit her hand really hard, and she said, and there was anger, and there was frustration, and anger, and tears, and anger, and frustration. And that's grieving. I've had people yell at me in their grief. And it wasn't me. It's called pain. So there's emotional and then there's physical effects, and you might feel guilty. You might have comments like Mary and Martha did to Jesus, you know, Lord, if you would have been there, my brother would not have died. And blame and pain and hurt are all encompassed inside that verse. And some days you might feel bad, some days you feel a little better, some days you just want to curl up on a couch and just cry all day. In John 11, the text says, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along also with her weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and troubled. You try to describe that. Deeply moved in his spirit and troubled, and he wept. So grief is not just the funeral and then it's over. Those of you that have experienced hard loss in your families or someone very close to you, I'd like to change the text just a little bit. When Jesus saw you weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and troubled. When Jesus saw you frustrated and angry, dazed and shocked, he was deeply moved for you as well. When Jesus saw your tears, when he saw your guilt that you feel, when Jesus felt your questions like Mary and Martha, Lord, if you would have been there, my brother would not have died. You know, that's not just a story. I've said those same things. Lord, if you just could have woke him up. Lord, if you could, And to that I say that, well, Jesus, if he was still on this earth, he would say, Logan, where have you laid him? And just like in the text in John 11, Jesus, come and see. And you know what? Jesus went. That's the Savior we serve. He's there for us. And so when grief affects you, when it's you, don't forget, it affects him too. There's a passage in Isaiah 53 and verse 3 that says, Jesus, a man of sorrows, he is acquainted with the deepest grief. Jared?
There we go. Well, we've probably all experienced grief in our own life. And because of that, we know the hurt, we know the pain. And so when we see other people who are grieving, we truly want to help them through that. We want to make it better. The definition of grief is a deep sorrow, especially that's caused by loss. And as Logan mentioned, it's not just death. Oftentimes it is a death of a loved one, but it can be so much more. It can be loss of a job or a home or loss of health. So many things that can cause grief. And because this world is imperfect, we suffer loss a lot. Those who we love suffer loss a lot, and we want to make it better. I want to look at the life of Job. Job had a few friends mentioned in the book, and we always look at them as bad examples of ways to help the grieving. But I think they did a few things right, and I think they did a few things wrong. And I want to look at both of those. And hopefully, as Logan said, there is no perfect answer it's going to work every time. That's not the way grief works. Everybody grieves differently. Everybody's situation is different. But hopefully, taking a look at this text, we can draw some things from it, and maybe we can be closer to doing the right thing. In Job 1:1, it says, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Job was a God-fearing man. He was a good man. In fact, the text says he was blameless and upright. This is not a guy who, like Job's friends later will claim, deserved for bad things to happen to him. We just live in a world that bad things happen. And sure enough, bad things do happen for Job. If you've read through the book before, you know that it was Satan's doing. But Satan takes everything from Job. In a moment, Job's world is turned upside down. Imagine that in your own life, to be in a situation like Job, where you hear you lose everyone that's close to you. You lose your children. You lose material possessions. I mean, back to back to back, probably within a minute's time, Job has just been told that everything that was dear to him is now gone. And you can imagine how crushed he was. In Job 1:22, it says, in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with any wrong. Even though Job has now lost everything, he's still a man of integrity. He's still doing the best that he can. It does not mean that he is not hurting. We will see in the text that he is hurting severely. But he's not blaming God. He's not lashing out. He's just hurting. Even after losing all of this, Satan's not done with him. Remember, Satan goes back before God, and God basically says, see, I told you Job was a man of integrity. He was a man that will follow me and stay true to me. And Satan says, yeah, that's just because you didn't let me touch him. You let me take everything around him, but you didn't let me touch him. And God has faith in Job. God says, go for it. Don't take his life. I know he's mine. And I think that may be something for us to learn from the get-go, is as we're going through difficulties, the Bible tells us we will never be allowed to be tempted beyond what we can bear. And Job was so strong that God allowed him to be tempted pretty hard, right? Maybe when we're facing the most difficult times in our life, God is saying, I know you can do this. I know you're strong enough to do this. I've seen your faith. Something for us to think about. But Satan comes, and now he takes his health away. On top of everything else, now he gives him leprosy. It says he has boils from the top of his head to the bottoms of his feet. And so when Job's friends enter, he has lost everything. He's sitting covered in boils, basically on a trash heap, scraping these boils with a broken pot. And here come his friends. And I think as we read through Job 2:11 through 13, we can look at this and we can go, Job's friends truly wanted to help. And I think they did some things right here. Look at Job 2, verse 11. Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they each from his own place, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Naamathite, they made an appointment together to come and show him sympathy and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. And they raised their voices and wept. And they tore their robes, and they sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him. For they saw that that his suffering was very great. I think they did so many things right here. First off, they went to be with Job. They were all from different towns, but they made an appointment and said, let's get together and surround him with love. Let's be there for him. Man, what a great example for us. We'll talk about this some more in a little bit. They share in his sorrow. They see him from a distance, and it says they can't even recognize him. And it's seeing that, it says they weep and they cry out and they tear their robes and they cover themselves in dust. They truly are sorrowful for Job because of his grief. They share in that suffering. And they sit there with him for 7 days and 7 nights, just being there. No one says a word. They just sit there together. That endurance, that long suffering is another thing we're going to see that can really help. And again, we'll come back to these in a moment and look at how we can apply them to our lives. But after these 7 days, Job speaks up. In Job chapter 3, you can read the whole chapter and you can see how badly he's still hurting. Just because his friends showed up and just because they cared and just because they showed him love, it didn't fix the pain yet. After 7 days, he speaks up in verse 1. It says, after this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job said, let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said a man is conceived. If you go down to verse 11, we see some more of how much pain he was feeling. Why did I not die at birth and come out of the womb and expire? In verse 26, he says, I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes. These are the first words that are spoken, it seems like, by any of the 4 of them. And it's essentially Job saying, I just wish it could all be over. I wish I was never born. Life is so hard right now. I am so troubled. I am so sorrowful. Again, put yourself in Job's place and we can understand that, right? But the problem is that it's at times like these, when people are expressing their pain to us, that what we want the most is to make them feel better. We want to fix it. We want to take their pain away. And that's just not how grief works. There's nothing that these three can say to make it better. They cannot bring his family back. They cannot immediately help him go through these stages of grief. They can't fix his health. There's nothing that they can say that is going to make Job feel better. And you know what? That's okay. That's okay, because pain is a sign that something is wrong. I think a lot of times we look at grief and we just want people to be happy again, and that comes from a good place. We want them to be happy. But you know, if we met somebody who had broken their back and was lying in bed, the last thing we would do is say, it's all going to be okay. Just get back to your normal life. Hurry back to that. No, we understand that there's a healing process. There's going to be much of their life that they can't do everything that they could before. They may never be the same person that they were before because of the pain, because of the healing. But with grief, it makes us so uncomfortable that someone is not happy, that someone is hurting, that oftentimes we feel we need to speak up to try to instantly fix it. And that's where we usually get into trouble. We have nothing that we can say that is going to automatically fix someone's grief. I want to look through some of the things that Job's friends said, and there's like 30 chapters of this stuff, so by no means am I going to cover it all. But I just want to show you some of the examples of the things they were trying to say. And by the way, I think they were coming from an honest place. It's three friends. They've sat there with him for 7 days. I don't think they're trying to hurt his feelings. I think they're trying to get him to a place where he can be happy again. But they're going about it in a completely wrong way. Job chapter 4, verses 3 through 6 is one of the things that was said. Job 4, 3 through 6. Behold, you have instructed many, and you have strengthened the weak hands. Your words have upheld him who was stumbling, and you have made firm the feeble knees. But now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. He's saying, what are you so shocked for? These kind of things happen to everybody. It's just your turn. You know, doesn't that sound like something when we don't know what to say that we would try to say, oh yeah, these things happen. I know it happens to everybody. And we're coming from an honest place. Maybe this will help someone feel better, but it doesn't. It doesn't help us to hear, you know, everyone's dealing with grief, so you're nothing special. We need to be careful with what we say. Job chapter 5, verse 8. As for me, I would seek God, and to God would I commit my cause. Well, you know, if I was in your situation, here's how I would handle it. Well, you know what? You're not. You're not in my situation. You don't understand my situation. You don't understand what I'm feeling. You don't know what I'm going through. So I really don't need to know how you would handle the situation. In chapter 8, verse 2, in between all of these, Job from time to time is speaking up and saying, look guys, y'all aren't helping, and I'm still hurting. And then they will say things like this in verse 2, how long will you say these things, and the words of your mouth be a great wind? You shouldn't talk like that. When people say, I wish that I was never born, I'm hurting so bad. Oh, don't say that. Don't say those things. Again, you see, we're coming from a good place, but we're not being helpful. And that's where Job's friends are at. Don't talk like that, Job. Don't say these things. But Job's hurting. In Job chapter 11, verse 13. If you prepare your heart, you will stretch out your hands toward him. If iniquity is in your hand, put it far away, and let not injustice dwell in your tents. Surely then you will lift up your face without blemish. You will be secure and will not fear. You will forget your misery, and you will remember it as waters that have passed away. Just follow God, and everything's going to get better really soon. Trust in Him, and this is all going to be a distant memory. Well, Logan just mentioned, he was talking to people today, we may never get completely through the grieving process. That pain may never leave. And we're telling people, if you would just trust God more, you would be happy again. How does that make us feel when we're already hurting and someone says, well, the reason you're hurting is because you don't trust God enough? It doesn't help. It doesn't help us at all. One more thing that they said, and again, y'all read through there and you'll see that there's a lot more to this. Job chapter 20, verse 29. This is the wicked man's portion from God, the heritage decreed for him by God. God caused all this to happen. And they're saying, because of your sin. But you know, I've probably been guilty of it as well, putting that God caused all these bad things to happen to you. And is that true? Does God want all these bad things to happen to us? Who caused it in Job's account? It was Satan, wasn't it? And a lot of times we'll say things like, well, God just needed to take him home. He was ready for him. I guess. God's going to work this all out for good. I know you lost your job, but He's got a bigger plan for you. He wanted this to happen. I don't know if all of that's true. Maybe God wasn't behind all of those things. And we're just saying, well, the way you're hurting and the way you're experiencing this pain, you're not trusting in God's plan. Again, not all that helpful. Not really something that is helping Job through his pain. How does Job feel about their comfort once they've started speaking up? In Job chapter 16, verses 1 through 5, he says this, I have heard many such things. Miserable comforters are you all. Shall windy words have no end, or what provokes you that you answer? I also could speak as you do, if you were in my place. I could join words together against you and shake my head at you. I could strengthen you with my mouth, and the solace of my lips would assuage your pain. He's saying, think about if you were in my position. I could throw empty words at you or two, and it's not helping. He said, you're miserable comforters. How did God feel about it? Turn all the way over to chapter 42, verse 7. After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. God wasn't real pleased with their comforting when they started speaking up either. Again, I'm not trying to call us out. I feel like I can teach this lesson because I have done all the wrong things. I have tried to be a comforter through specifically Jessica's grief. And as I look back, while she has been suffering, how many times have I said, just cheer up. Just be happy. And she's saying, my world is crumbling around me, and you're saying cheer up? Yeah, but that would make me feel better. It would make me feel good if you could get past all of this and just act like everything's okay. And so as I'm talking about these things, don't think that I'm getting on to anybody. I just am speaking from experience that we're really kind of bad at this. But I think we can see from Job's friends' first 7 days how we can be better. Again, not everybody's grief is exactly the same. Some people are going to need things differently than others. We've got to use wisdom. But I think here's a good guideline. Back to the 3 things they did in those first 7 days. If we want to help, the first thing we can do is be present. Job's friends came from 3 separate towns and just sat there with him, just showing that they cared. If you look at 2 Timothy chapter 1, verses 15 through 18, there's an account here that I think is pretty helpful for us. Of course, Paul is writing this letter from prison, and as you read through 2 Timothy, you'll see that Paul considers himself on death row. He doesn't think he's getting out of this one. And it's a pretty big burden because he feels very alone. Nobody is with him. Verse 15 of chapter 1. You are aware that all who were in Asia turned away from me, among whom are Phygelus and Hermogenes. In his time of need, not only does he feel alone because he's in jail, but he says everyone in Asia has left him. And he names 2 people specifically. I think he would say them by name either because Timothy would know exactly who they were, or because these were 2 people that he thought never would have left him. But he finds himself all alone. But he goes on to say in verse 16, "May the Lord grant mercy to the household of Onesiphorus, for he often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains. But when he arrived in Rome, he searched for me earnestly, and he found me. May the Lord grant to him to find mercy from the Lord on that day." This guy was from Ephesus, and he traveled all the way to Rome, which looks to be around 1,000 miles, just to be with Paul. Could he fix the situation? Didn't spring him out of jail. Couldn't take care of the thing that was bringing him this burden. Probably couldn't stop him from being executed, but he could be there, and he could be present. And what did Paul say that did for him? It refreshed him. It helped. It helped to have him there. You don't know what to do? Be there. Be there in some way or another. Call, text, send a card, sit with someone, take care of things that they may not want to be taken care of, mowing the lawn, cleaning the house, cooking meals. I think we're all really good at this. Don't be so scared to do something because you don't know what to say. Just be there. I think Onesiphorus was a really good example of this. He went 1,000 miles out of his way in order to just be there with Paul. Another thing, share in their sorrow. For those first 7 days, Job's friends wept and tore their robes and covered themselves in dust and just let him know, we're here with you. We suffer because you suffer. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 26 is a verse that you probably are familiar with, but I want us to read it. It says, "If one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together." We're a family. We're the body of Christ. You don't know what to say? That's okay. Say, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry that this is happening, and I love you." Because nothing else that you say is going to fix the problem. You can't take away the pain, but you can let them know, I truly am sorry that this is happening. I love you, and if there's anything that I can do, I'm going to be here. Just ask me. And you may need to do that over and over and over again so that they see you really mean it and that you really care. The last thing we saw Job's friends do was be long-suffering. Can you imagine sitting with somebody for 7 days and not saying a word? when we are going to deal with somebody, when we're going to talk to somebody who's dealing with loss, we get awkward because we don't know what to say. I remember when my grandpa died, I had a cousin come up to me right before they were going to go talk to my grandma, and they said, "What do I say? What can you say to somebody at this time?" I said, "Just tell her you love her." Because you can't bring them back. You can't fix it. But we're so worried about what am I going to say. The best thing they did was not say anything, was not try to fix it. They were just there continually, over and over and over again. We've got to be long-suffering. We're a family, and in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 13, we're told this. "But exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin." Grief is not a cookie-cutter thing. It's not a clean process. We don't just hop through these stages. We don't just get better in 7 days. It takes a long time. And the best thing we can do is continue to show people we care over and over and over again. Not trying to fix their problems, not trying to make everything better, but showing them that they are loved and cared for. This is kind of a tough lesson because I would like to be able to hand you something to say, here's the magic phrase that will make everyone's grief all better. But we know that doesn't exist. Be present, share in their sorrow, and be long-suffering. I think that's the best that we can do. I am thankful that we have this family. You guys are too, I know that. Because we have a lot of grief. But how much harder would it be if we were all alone? Jesus is on our side, and we have a whole body of believers, a family that is on our side and willing to help us through this. Some of you may need that help tonight. Some of you may be struggling. You can come now and ask for prayers, or you can do that privately. But don't suffer alone. You've got a family that loves you and cares for you. If you have any need, we ask that you would come and make it known as we stand and sing together.